Nelson Mandela, The Life and Legacy of the Father of South Africa, by Charles River Editors. Introduction. Nelson Mandela, 1918 to 2013. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for, but my Lord, if needs be, it is an ideal which I am prepared to die. Nelson Mandela, 1964. In the case of some historical figures, a single event or a small span of years is sufficient for understanding the timelessness and extent of their impact upon the world, but others have taken lengthier, more convoluted journeys with broadly evolved circumstances, intention and roles to be played, reinventing themselves and playing different roles as times change. Such is the case with Nelson Mandela, whose conflict with the apartheid government of South Africa was marked by an irrational and contrary stream of corrupt legislation intended to reverse the gains made in the cause of equality through the 19th and 20th centuries. The most basic descriptions of Nelson Mandela's life and career would include terms such as anti-apartheid revolutionary, politician, activist, philanthropist, but all of these monikers require extensive shading. He has at one time or another been called every complimentary and critical term available to a politician, and from specific times and perspectives, they all contain some hint of truth. Mandela was a child without citizenship from his own country, without any notion of its history, but in the end, he became the first of his race to lead it and to re-establish a franchise for those of his heritage. He is the communist sympathizer who pleaded with the United States Congress that the blessings of democracy be brought to his country, and the adoptee of nonviolence who led the military wing of the African National Congress when pacifism no longer seemed feasible. Unlike the rise of national leaders of African heritage in modern times, Mandela's rise to presidency literally began amidst 19th century conditions in which the exclusionary pro-white business groups that took over southern Africa before his birth were able to legislate and codify apartheid into an accepted institution during his life. While he is now one of the most beloved figures of the 20th century and almost universally praised, few are familiar with more than a basic outline of his life, including his lengthy imprisonment for working against South Africa's apartheid government, his release from jail, and his ascent to South Africa's presidency, and his tireless charitable work on behalf of peace, fighting HIV, and more. As a young man, Mandela was educated at the University College of Fort Hare and the University of Witwatersrand, where he studied law. A political anti-colonialist, African nationalist, and democratic socialist, he joined the African National Congress in 1944 and was a founding member of the Youth League. His chief political passions were the elimination of institutional racism, poverty, inequality, and the eventual reconciliation of South Africa's many factions, with the official policy of apartheid a condition of separateness. Instituted in 1948 by an occupying all-white government, Mandela was tried for treason between the years of 1956 to 61 before being acquitted. He participated in the Defiance Campaign of 1952 and oversaw the 1955 Congress of the People. But when the African National Congress was banned in 1960, he proposed a military wing, despite his initial reluctance toward violent resistance, a reluctance which had its roots in original nonviolent protests through the South African Communist Party. The ANC did not openly discourage such an idea, and the Umkhonto we Sizwe was established. Mandela was again arrested in 1962 and tried for attempts to overthrow the government by violence. The sentence was 5 years of hard labor, but this was increased to a life sentence in 1964, a sentence handed down to 7 of his closest colleagues as well. Mandela would eventually serve 27 years, but his statements made in court received enormous international coverage and acclaim and his reputation grew during his time in Robben Island, the prison of Cape Town, the Pollsmoor and the Victor Verster prisons. He was ultimately released in February 1990, in large part as a result of the international campaign generated by his words and the current South African story. Shortly after that, he was elected as the first man of African descent to the presidency of South Africa, which he held from 1994 to 1999. Most significant was that Mandela was elected from the first multi-factional, multiracial election ever held in the country, a result of extensive negotiations with then-President F.W. Clerk. In the last 2 years of his term as president, Mandela also served as Secretary General of the Non-Aligned Movement. Once elected to the presidency, Mandela wasted no time in establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the purpose of which was in part to investigate former abuses. He encouraged land reform and greatly expanded and equalized medical care services. A respected figure by most people, Mandela even served as the mediator of the Pan Am 103 bombing case and directed military operations in Lesotho, a landlocked country of 2 million surrounded by South Africa, a constitutional monarchy and strong public opponent of apartheid. Mandela chose not to run for a second term as president and was replaced by Deputy Thabo Mbeki, but he soon gained the public's perception as an elder statesman, known for his charitable work against poverty and AIDS through the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Despite being targeted with the labels of terrorist and communist sympathizer, Mandela has received over 250 international honors, including the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize, the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Soviet Order of Lenin. He is frequently called by his Xhosa clan name, Madiba, or simply as Tata, Father, or Father of the Nation. Chapter 1. The History of Apartheid in South Africa. Nelson Mandela's life and struggles were deeply rooted in apartheid, which itself had a history stretching back over a century before his birth. The official installation of apartheid in South Africa remained true to the ancient habit of legislating against current trends in other parts of the world, perhaps something to be expected from countries with such legislative backgrounds as the British and Dutch. For the official years following 1948, the legislative landscape, in fact, looked much the same. The Cape Articles of Capitulation were established in 1806 and grounded in Roman Dutch law, requiring that the British colonial leaders respect the system as if it were their own, thereby abandoning British common law. Nowhere else in the British Empire did this occur. Under these articles, the indigenous Khoikhoi, the real or bush people, were labeled Hottentots by incoming Europeans, an offensive term in its modern usage. The Khoikhoi were required to carry passes in order to move about within the country, and after the imposition of the 1809 Hottentot Proclamation, they were required to carry passes for purposes of travel as well. Blacks were also required to carry passes and could only relocate to seek work. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 in Britain officially ended slavery in the British Empire. But the indentured servant system that remained widely employed was often very much the same thing, and many non-white citizens throughout the empire saw little change in their lives. The Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892 limited most means of attaining income or attaining more than rudimentary education for black citizens, and the Natal Legislative Assembly Bill deprived Indians of the vote in 1894. The General Pass Regulations Bill of 1905 similarly removed the black citizenry from the voter rolls. The Union of South Africa was established in 1910, 8 years before Nelson Mandela's birth. Among its first domestic actions were to remove all blacks from seats in Parliament and prohibit the buying of land through the Native Land Act of 1813. The Natives in Urban Areas Bill of 1918 forced the black population, not truly citizens by this time, into residential zones, and the 1923 version of the act virtually segregated all residential areas, offering work only in white-owned and governed industry. By 1926, via the Color Bar Act, no black person was allowed to practice skilled labor of any kind, and by 1927 all African affairs were under the control of the British Crown. The Representation of Natives Act in 1936 removed the last vestiges of the black vote, requiring that all black districts elect 3 white representatives to oversee their affairs in the legislature. The idea of integration, when considered at all, was summarily dismissed, most notably by the Sauer Commission, whose majority opinion held that the mixing of races, particularly with the white race, would diminish the personality of ethnic groups. The adoption of apartheid in 1948 was accomplished by the Verenigde Nationale Party, the reunited National Party, headed by Protestant clerk Daniel Francois Malan, who had campaigned in support of the policy. This party gained popularity after World War II and won the elections unexpectedly. The party's roots were embedded in the Anglo-Boer Wars of 1880 to 1881 and 1899 to 1902, which pitted Great Britain against the 2 Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic. After narrowly winning election, Malan formed a coalition with a rival white party and became the nation's prime minister. Ultimately, the 2 parties merged, forming the National Party, the official position of which was that South Africa would not be one unified nation. South Africa would separate the white population, and the 4 distinct racial groups all present would coalesce within themselves and carry on a self-governed life with severely limited powers beneath the overarching white rule. The principles of the Grand Apartheid were to compel the races to separate in every conceivable way, while day-to-day regimen and law would proceed under the petty apartheid system. In the year 1950, the Population Registration Act, with roots all the way back to the Anglo-Boer conflicts, completed the formulation of racial classification. The second piece of legislation, holding apartheid up as the law of the land, was the Group Areas Act, also established in 1950, which ended all diversity in any of the non-white residential zones. In 1951, the Prevention of Illegal Squatting Act allowed the government to dispense with obsolete housing as it wished, and massive numbers of slum structures were demolished. The early 1950s also saw the enactment of the Prohibition of Mixed Marriage Act, and the following Immorality Act forbade all sexual relations between non-white groups, making such acts a criminal offense. The Bantu Authorities Act of 1951 had created separate structures for virtually all activities, further reducing the zones into self-monitoring enclaves. By 1953, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act had accomplished the separation and marking of all public services. Naturally, implementing apartheid and ensuring its survival required dealing with dissent, and Stone-Med resistance sought to resist destabilization of non-white groups by communist organizations in the Suppression of Communism Act. A state of entirely segregated education was completed by the 1953 Bantu Education Act, and black education was narrowed to prepare black residents only for their lives as laborers, with few exceptions. Shortly afterward, all industry was halted in white sectors and moved to non-white zones. Separate universities were built in 1959, and by use of the Black Homeland Citizenship Act of 1970, black citizenship in South Africa was effectively eliminated. In any viewing of a historic timeline, it becomes immediately clear that South Africa was moving in the opposite direction of the global trend away from slavery and toyed at least a glimmer of what would become the state of modern equality. Indeed, that trend was taking place across different parts of the world during the middle of the 20th century, most notably through the work of Martin Luther King in the U.S. and Gandhi in India. It's arguable that this was the reason for such a lengthy and detailed thread of anti-integration legislation by South Africa. But at the same time, black South Africans couldn't help but be familiar with the struggles of men like Gandhi and King. Needless to say, Mandela would not be isolated from or in any way unaware of the evolving stature of King and Gandhi in their separate societies but similar struggles. Despite state attempts to curb resistance, the official installation of apartheid during the most formative professional years of Mandela's life could not help but attract the ear of such an anti-colonialist with an activist spirit and a background in law. The post-World War II Afrikaner minority rule that took hold through the domination of the National Party and the Broederbond groups in affinity were similarly active in Southwest Africa, governed under a League of Nations mandate by the Dutch and British. Broederbond or Broederbond refers to a clandestine, all-male Calvinist sect dedicated to Afrikaner interest and to the exclusion of all else. The organization had one main aim: to further Afrikaner nationalism in Africa, to maintain Afrikaner culture, develop an Afrikaner economy, and to gain control of the South African government. In all of South Africa, white, black, colored, and Indian populations were clearly separated into a new set of 10 self-governing sectors called Bantustans. The term Bantu refers to the general labor for those of ethnic Bantu language groups that inhabit central, eastern, western, and southern regions of the continent. Anti-apartheid activists were imprisoned, and the only solutions that would force any movement on the issue over the coming decades were the inner resistance and a mounting international trade and arms embargo, led by a wave of public opinion that perceived South Africa as going in the opposite direction from the natural tide of history. Chapter 2. Mandela's Early Years. It was in this environment that Mandela was born in 1918, the same year the black population lost its right to location of residence. Fittingly, his forename was Rolilaha, a local colloquial term meaning troublemaker. While the surname Mandela came from his father, Mandela is frequently referred to as Madiba as well, a reference to his clan. But despite the fact Mandela's family had once held power in Eastern Cape Province, colonial power had quickly diminished the power of indigenous leaders. Born in the village of Mvezo in Umtatu in the South African Cape Province, Mandela was raised with his two sisters and spent many of his earliest days herding cattle. It would take some time before a realization of racial imbalance fully registered in his mind, and before a love for African culture would take hold. In fact, he admitted later in life that much of his politically restricted childhood was based in custom, ritual, and taboo. At the age of 7, Mandela entered the nearby Methodist school, having been baptized as such, and he received the name of Nelson from his teacher. Still ignorant of the overall situation in his country, he nevertheless claims to have inherited his father's spirited rebelliousness and stubborn sense of fairness in those years. He also explained the origins of the name Nelson. No one in my family had ever attended school. On the first day of the school, my teacher, Miss Mdingame, gave each of us an English name. This was the custom among Africans in those days and was undoubtedly due to the British bias of our education. That day, Miss Mdingame told me that my new name was Nelson. Why this particular name, I have no idea. Separated from his mother a short time later, Mandela was left under the tutelage of the Tembu regent, Jojintaba Dalindyelio, and he would not see his mother for many years. But the Christian faith in which he had been raised increased in strength through his youth. He continued at the Methodist Mission School and still viewed the Europeans as benefactors, but he was also beginning to cast an eye toward African history as well. His secondary education was at the Clarkbury Boarding Institute of Nkobo, from which he earned a junior certificate in 2 years. In 1937, Mandela moved to Healdtown and attended the Methodist College of Fort Beaufort. But despite an ongoing indoctrination into British culture as superior among the societies of the world, his interest in African culture continued to increase. At the same time, he took up a number of sports such as running and boxing, and he even took a course in ballroom dancing, all of which would round out the refined British gentleman. His following studies were taken at the University at Fort Hare and Alice, Eastern Cape, and were directed toward a Bachelor of Arts degree. Here he studied politics and anthropology, Roman Dutch law, a legal system based on Roman law practiced in the Netherlands in the 17th and 18th centuries, and to this day employed by South African courts. However, as non-British ideas crept further into his subconscious, Mandela participated in the performance of a play on Abraham Lincoln, studied a wider range of politics, and boycotted against the university because of its offering of poor quality food to students. For this, he was suspended and left without a degree. The 1948 general election in South Africa was a whites-only affair.